The Supreme Court might be seeing a case to overturn gay marriage, so we should talk about that. But before we do, this is your reminder to subscribe to this channel and give this video a thumbs up. And while you're down there, click the notification bell so that you are notified every time I post a new video, which is every Monday and Friday. All of my other social medias are linked down below if you're interested. I post short form content on those. Make sure you check all of that out. And without any further ado, let's dive in. All right, you guys. So I really just wanted to kind of briefly look over the facts of what is going on, how this could happen, and maybe even look at why this is happening a little bit. Because while the case has not, I am filming this on August 13th, so at this point in time, the case has not been officially brought. I think it's likely that it will within the next year or two. But in that case, I want to discuss it. Okay, so first things first. This case centers on Obergefell, which was ruled on in 2015, and the decision deemed that same-sex marriage was now federally recognized across the United States. This was ruled based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. However, the 14th Amendment does not explicitly say anything about marriage, which is why this case has a chance of being overturned. It is this lack of textual and specified constitutional mention that got Roe overturned ultimately, because nowhere in the Constitution does a woman have a right to an abortion. So they went with it on the basis of privacy. And the basic connecting idea here is substantive due process, which, when is used right, it acts almost as guardrails essentially on the courts and the government to protect our constitutional rights, meaning a court cannot take away a person's constitutional rights without due process. That's the Fifth Amendment. However, it is controversial because the court is often viewed as overstepping the bounds of that substantive due process when ruling on cases. Essentially, instead of protecting constitutional rights, they are creating constitutional rights out of thin air. That is exactly what happened with Roe. And actually, Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself even was against taking this approach for abortion because she felt like it was flimsy judicial ruling, and she would have preferred to take legislative steps through Congress so that it would have been solidified into law and it wouldn't have been able to be overturned, which is exactly what ended up happening, and that is exactly what is looking like it's going to happen for Obergefell. So essentially, marriage is not mentioned in the 14th Amendment, so it was a stretch outside of the court to make this ruling. So in the case that is being brought, it's being brought by a woman named Kim Davis, I believe in Kentucky, because shortly after the ruling, she was locked in jail. Not prison, it was just jail, for 6 days because she refused to issue a marriage certificate. Now, that is obviously wrong, and to throw someone in jail over that is insane. She should have lost her job. She should have been fired because at that point, it is the ruling, however flimsy or unconstitutional it may be, that is the ruling, and so she should have been fired for it, but to throw her in jail is literally insane. So as I was saying, the court has not brought this case yet. I do not think that it is outside of the scope of possibility, especially considering Roe v. Wade, and they only need 4 justices to sign on to take up the case. At this point, it does beg the question of, is it worth it to open this can of worms? I personally do not think that it is. I don't think it's politically advantageous. I don't think that you can put the genie back in the bottle per se. I understand that when this happened, people were talking about the slippery slope, and we are going to get into that. And I do think that that happened, and we're going to talk about why and how that happened. And maybe it's because of that we're in this position. We're going to get into all of that, but I don't think overturning this is going to undo any of that. I think it's just going to create more chaos. That's my opinion. But that said, I do actually think that it would be good to rework the precedent that has been set with these sort of cases. I don't think that having the precedent of the judges being able to interpret the Constitution how they want is necessarily good. And obviously with any court hearing, there's going to be some level of interpretation. But it seems to be taken to such a level with these cases that it just creates chaos because they rule on it and then it eventually gets overturned because it was based on flimsy determination, essentially. However, you also at that point have to consider the gate that opens when you continue down this path, because it would open the door to looking at other landmark cases such as Loving versus Virginia, which is interracial marriage, or even Meyer versus Nebraska, which essentially established parental rights in education. It does establish a certain precedent that all of these cases have in common. Because I am of the opinion, obviously, that a lot of these rulings are really important to have. I would just feel better about them if they were statutory rather than judicial. And I think that we went wrong with setting this past precedent, which does go back over 100 years. Some of these cases were happening in the 1920s, maybe even earlier. And it just, more power to the government is never good. And the lack of boundaries around this precedent can be a problem. So those are kind of the how it could potentially be brought and overturned. That's that. Now, as far as a solution goes, there's a lot of debate about this. Some people think, just overturn it and say, screw it. I disagree with that take. I think that there's a lot of same-sex couples who deserve to have marriage or a union of some kind. And so it could potentially be, federalizing civil unions so that you get all of the tax benefits and all of the legal benefits that come with a marriage so that you are still united as one in the eyes of the law. However, I know that there are same-sex couples who are strong Christians and are very religious. And is it right to take that away from them? I know that there are going to be hardline Christians who think that that is wrong, but a middle ground could be just, making it legal for a church to say no to providing that service. If a church does not want to marry a same-sex couple, they should not have to, because at the end of the day, that is actually an infringement on your freedom of religion. So there are a couple of different routes that could be taken here. Again, I will say I do not think that flat out overturning it without some kind of counterbalance is a good thing. I don't foresee that going well, and it just doesn't feel like the right move to me. People are going to call me wishy-washy in the comments for that, but I don't care. I wouldn't be being real with you guys if I told you otherwise. I think any of these solutions could be a good solution, but the reality of the situation is none of them are probably going to be good enough for the current rendition of LGBTQ activists. And that's the greatest irony here, is that it is the current rendition of LGBTQ activists that have opened the public opinion up to even being open to overturning gay marriage. Because when this passed in 2015, it was relatively popular. And I think gay marriage as it stands is still probably more popular than it is not, but it is the other issues that are being pushed that are then kind of having a downstream effect onto gay marriage. This will be things like childhood transitioning or talking about LGBTQ issues in the classroom. And the big question is, why did it get to that point? And this is where we do get into the slippery slope, because in 2015, when this passed, the activists at the time really were staking on the fact that this was it. This was the big thing that they were fighting for. This was the last frontier. Gay marriage was the end-all be-all of everything they had worked for. And then when it passed, what then? You have all of these nonprofits and all of these charities who suddenly don't have anything to advocate for. And, the money is going to dry up if that's the case, so you move on to the next thing, even though that was supposed to be the thing. And this is the problem with a lot of these activists in general, is enough is never enough. And then it went into the child transitioning. You get the gender theory, you get pushing it in schools. And when COVID happened, parents became aware of all of this stuff that had been being pushed in schools. And it really turned the public sentiment into a negative light towards the LGBTQ movement. And it's just the irony of the activists who claim to be helping the movement are the ones that are destroying it. Because the things that they are currently pushing are popular with almost no one. And because of that, it is putting a bad light on the things that are probably not as big of a deal as men competing in women's sports. You know what I'm saying? And that's how you get to where we're at today. The radical advocates in this movement have done more harm to it than any homophobe ever could. So those are my thoughts and opinions on it. I am sure that there's going to be a good handful of you who are upset that I don't have a more hardline take on gay marriage, but honestly, it's just not a hill that I care to die on. It just isn't. So duke it out in the comments down below, and that's all I got for you guys. Happy Monday. Hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you on Friday. Bye!